In 2004, Dawn of the Dead didn't just return to theaters, it challenged an entire generation's understanding of what a zombie film could be. The remake moved faster, looked harsher, and stripped away the satirical distance that once separated horror from reality. But what audiences witnessed on screen was only part of the story. Behind the chaos, the production itself became a place where boundaries were constantly tested, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Real injuries were mistaken for practical effects. Creative decisions triggered outrage from die-hard fans. Studio executives were forced to approve scenes that many believed should never have existed. And one of the most influential voices in zombie cinema openly questioned whether the film had any meaning at all. This remake didn't just divide audiences, it unsettled its cast, its crew, and even the genre's creator. What seemed like a slick, high-energy horror reboot was quietly shaped by accidents, creative battles, and moments that blurred the line between fiction and reality. In several cases, what went wrong behind the camera proved more disturbing than anything shown on screen. Today, we're uncovering 20 disturbing, bizarre, and shocking facts about Dawn of the Dead 2004, from unintentional injuries and real-world backlash to controversial creative choices that nearly didn't make the final cut. These are the details that stayed buried in commentary tracks, production notes, and uneasy memories. And once you know them, the film may never feel the same again. Number 1. A prosthetic was accidentally stitched to a real arm. For one of the film's most intense early scenes, director Snyder wanted absolute realism. When Anna stitches Kenneth's arm, the camera lingers closely on the needle-piercing flesh. To achieve that effect, Snyder hired a real medical professional, a trained nurse, to perform the close-up stitching rather than relying on simulated hand movements. What went wrong was not negligence, but miscommunication. Snyder instructed the nurse to go deeper with the needle to sell the realism of the wound. Interpreting the instruction literally, she drove the needle through the prosthetic and into Ving Rhames' actual skin. Without realizing it, she stitched the rubber appliance directly onto his arm. Rhames didn't stop the take. He didn't shout or pull away. The scene continued as planned. Blood appeared on camera, and from the director's perspective, it only reinforced how convincing the effect looked. Snyder later admitted that when he noticed the blood, he assumed it was part of the makeup design, doing its job perfectly. Only after the scene wrapped did Rhames calmly reveal the truth. The blood wasn't fake, the pain wasn't acting, the prosthetic had been physically sewn to his flesh. What the director believed was an impressive practical effect turned out to be a genuine injury captured in real time. The moment perfectly illustrates the uncomfortable line Dawn of the Dead often crossed. In its pursuit of authenticity, the production blurred the boundary between simulated horror and real physical risk. Unlike stories of actors suffering for art, this incident wasn't planned or glorified. It was accidental, avoidable, and quietly endured, an unsettling reminder that sometimes the most disturbing moments happen when no one realizes anything has gone wrong. Number #2. Ving Rhames personally hunted down the producers to secure his role. Ving Rhames didn't come to Dawn of the Dead through the usual Hollywood channels. When he heard that a remake was in development, he didn't wait for casting calls or agency negotiations. Instead, he took matters into his own hands. Rhames actively tracked down the film's producers himself, making it clear that he wanted the role of Kenneth and that he wanted it badly. His interest wasn't casual. Rhames saw something different in the project, even before cameras started rolling. He was drawn to the diversity of the cast, the grounded tone of the script, and Zack Snyder's visual sensibility, which promised a harsher, more physical take on the zombie genre. But there was another reason he later joked about, one that carried a sharper edge. In this version of the story, the black character doesn't die first. For decades, horror cinema had been dominated by familiar patterns, and Rhames was fully aware of them. He appreciated that Kenneth was written as capable, rational, and resilient, someone who wasn't defined by panic or sacrifice. More importantly, the character survives until the very end of the theatrical cut. For Rhames, that wasn't just a narrative choice. It was a quiet rejection of a trope that audiences had long accepted without question. By pursuing the role directly, Rhames wasn't just securing screen time. He was aligning himself with a version of the film that challenged expectations, both within the genre and beyond it. Kenneth wasn't written as a symbol, but his survival carried weight regardless. In a movie obsessed with who lives, who dies, and who gets left behind, Rhames made sure his character would not be erased early, and he did it by refusing to wait for permission. Number 3. The zombie baby scene required direct approval from studio executives. One of the most unsettling moments in Dawn of the Dead nearly didn't exist at all. The infamous zombie baby scene, brief, shocking, and deeply uncomfortable, originated entirely from screenwriter James Gunn. From the moment it was proposed, the idea stood out as something that crossed an invisible line, even by horror standards. Zack Snyder immediately supported the concept. He later stated that he loved the idea precisely because of how disturbing it was. To Snyder, the scene captured the film's worldview in its purest form. Nothing was sacred, and survival came at the cost of innocence. But enthusiasm from the director wasn't enough. The scene was deemed so extreme that it was escalated directly to studio executives for approval. The concern wasn't technical, it was moral. Showing a reanimated infant, even briefly, raised questions about taste, audience tolerance, and potential backlash. To minimize risk, the baby was created using a careful blend of animatronics and CGI, ensuring that no single shot lingered too long. Every frame was scrutinized. Every cut was deliberate. In the end, the executives approved the scene, and it made it into the final film. Almost immediately, it became one of the most controversial elements of the remake. Some viewers saw it as gratuitous. Others viewed it as the logical endpoint of a world where humanity had already collapsed. Years later, Snyder would return to the same idea in Army of the Dead, reinforcing just how strongly the moment resonated with him. The zombie baby wasn't included for shock alone. It was a test of audience limits, of studio boundaries, and of how far modern horror was willing to go once nothing was off the table. Number 4. James Gunn received handwritten death threats for writing the remake. Before a single frame of Dawn of the Dead was released, the backlash had already begun. When James Gunn was announced as the screenwriter for the remake, the reaction from hardcore fans of George A. Romero's original film was swift and hostile. To them, Gunn wasn't a horror writer. He was the man behind the live-action Scooby-Doo movie, a resume they considered unforgivable. The outrage quickly moved beyond online complaints. Gunn later revealed that he received handwritten death threats sent directly to him, condemning his involvement with the project. For fans who had grown up idolizing Romero's work, the idea that a filmmaker associated with a family-friendly franchise was rewriting Dawn of the Dead felt like an act of betrayal. They feared the remake would strip the story of its intelligence, its social commentary, and its soul. At the time, Gunn's career hadn't yet redefined him as a bold genre voice. He was seen as an outsider, trespassing on sacred ground. The anger wasn't about the script itself. Most of the critics hadn't read a single page. It was about identity, ownership, and the belief that some stories should remain untouched by the wrong hands. The hostility only began to fade after influential film critic Harry Knowles read Gunn's script and publicly praised it on Ain't It Cool News. That endorsement shifted the narrative. Doubt turned into curiosity. Hatred softened into cautious optimism. But by then, the damage had already been done. The episode serves as a stark reminder of how volatile fan culture can become when nostalgia feels threatened. Long before audiences could judge the film on its own terms, its writer had already been punished for daring to reinterpret a modern classic. Number 5. The mall used in the film was demolished just weeks after filming ended. The Crossroads Mall, seen in Dawn of the Dead, was never meant to survive. The location, Thornhill Square Shopping Center in Toronto, had already been scheduled for demolition before the production ever arrived. When the filmmakers discovered it, they realized they had found something rare, a massive indoor space they could transform without worrying about long-term damage. What followed was an 8-week overhaul. The production team rebuilt the mall almost from scratch, converting roughly 45,000 square feet into a believable consumer paradise, frozen in time. 14 fully functional storefronts were constructed. Parking structures and warehouse areas were added. Even a decorative water feature was installed near the entrance to sell the illusion of a once thriving public space. Most of the store names were fictional. Major corporations were hesitant to be associated with a violent zombie film, and many refused permission outright. Only a handful of brands, including Roots and Panasonic, agreed to appear on screen. Others, most notably Starbucks, declined entirely, unwilling to link their image to the film's apocalyptic violence. Once filming wrapped in 2003, the mall's fate was sealed. Demolition crews moved in shortly afterward, and the structure was partially torn down to make room for office complexes. Today, the Crossroads Mall no longer exists in any physical form. Fans can't visit it. There's nothing to photograph. What remains is only the version preserved on film, a fully realized world built with painstaking detail, erased almost immediately after it served its purpose. In a story obsessed with decay and disappearance, the mall itself became one of the most literal casualties. Number 6. Real amputees were cast to play limbless zombies. Rather than relying on visual tricks or digital manipulation, Zack Snyder made a deliberate choice that unsettled even seasoned crew members. For several of the film's most disturbing zombie appearances, he cast real amputees instead of using CGI or camera illusions. The decision was rooted in realism. Snyder wanted the horror to feel physical, unavoidable, and grounded in reality. Two moments stand out in particular: the armless jogging zombie sprinting toward the mall and the legless zombie dragging itself across the parking garage floor. These weren't visual effects layered in during post-production. They were real bodies, moving in real space, captured exactly as they appeared. By doing this, the production eliminated the artificial stiffness that often gives away digital effects. The movements felt wrong in a way that was difficult to fake. The weight distribution, the balance, the raw physicality, all of it contributed to an instinctive discomfort that audiences felt without necessarily understanding why. This approach wasn't entirely unprecedented. George A. Romero had used an amputee zombie in the original Dawn of the Dead in 1978, and Snyder's choice unintentionally echoed that earlier commitment to practical authenticity. However, the scale and intensity were pushed further in the remake, aligning with its faster pace and harsher tone. What makes the choice unsettling isn't just the realism, but the ethical tension it introduces. The film doesn't explain these bodies, it doesn't soften their presence. They exist purely as part of the nightmare, forcing the audience to confront something undeniably real inside a fictional apocalypse. In a movie obsessed with physical survival, the use of real amputees blurred the line between performance and reality, making the horror feel less like spectacle and more like something observed uncomfortably close and impossible to ignore. Number 7. One of the film's most memorable lines was improvised in complete silence. Amid the relentless tension and violence, Dawn of the Dead contains a brief moment of dark humor that audiences still remember. The irony is that it wasn't planned at all. During the elevator escape scene, when CJ casually says, "I like this song," the line was never in the script. At the time of filming, there was no music playing. The elevator scene was shot in complete silence, with only the mechanical hum of the set and the actors' breathing filling the space. Michael Kelly, playing CJ, improvised the line on instinct, delivering it without knowing whether it would ever make sense in the final cut. The joke only came together later, during post-production. Editors decided to add "All Out of Love" by Air Supply over the sequence, transforming the improvised comment into a perfectly timed piece of deadpan humor. What had been an offhand remark suddenly became one of the film's most effective tonal shifts, a moment of absurd normalcy in the middle of collapse. The line works precisely because it wasn't engineered. It cuts through the horror without undermining it, reminding the audience that people often cling to small, irrational comforts when everything else is falling apart. The humor doesn't relieve tension, it sharpens it. In a film built on chaos and precision, one of its most human moments was created by accident. Silence gave it space, post-production gave it meaning, and what began as an unplanned remark became a defining beat that audiences never forgot. Number 8. Zack Snyder filmed much of the movie in chronological order due to inexperience. Dawn of the Dead marked Zack Snyder's first time directing a feature-length film, and that inexperience quietly shaped how the production unfolded. Unlike most large-scale films, which are shot out of sequence for efficiency, Snyder chose to film much of the story in chronological order. The decision wasn't artistic ambition, it was practical survival. At that stage in his career, Snyder wasn't yet comfortable juggling multiple timelines, emotional arcs, and continuity demands all at once. Shooting scenes as they occurred in the story allowed him to track character development in real time and reduce the risk of losing control over pacing and tone. As a result, the cast experienced the apocalypse as a gradual descent rather than a fragmented process. Relationships formed naturally. Tension escalated without being reset between takes. By the time the story reached its later stages, the exhaustion and emotional strain on screen mirrored what the actors themselves had been living through on set. However, the approach wasn't applied to the entire film. The original ending, cutting abruptly after the survivors escaped by boat, tested poorly with preview audiences. Viewers wanted closure, even if that closure was bleak. In response, additional scenes were filmed later at Universal Studios Hollywood long after the main production had wrapped. These late additions disrupted the chronological purity of the shoot, but they reshaped the film's final message. What began as a simple escape story became something darker and more final. In hindsight, Snyder's inexperience forced a method that unintentionally strengthened the film's realism. Sometimes, limitations don't weaken a production. They expose a rawness that more polished processes might have erased. Number 9. More than 300 zombies were placed in full makeup at the same time. On certain shooting days, the scale of Dawn of the Dead became almost unmanageable. More than 300 extras were transformed into zombies simultaneously, each one requiring a unique look that suggested decay, trauma, and time since death. This wasn't a digital crowd duplicated in post-production. It was a logistical operation unfolding in real space. The makeup process ran like an assembly line. Extras moved through a continuous rotation of makeup rooms, tents, and trailers, a system the crew referred to as a mill. Depending on the design, each zombie required anywhere from 1 to 4 hours of preparation. Prosthetics were glued, wounds were sculpted, and layers of discoloration were carefully applied until no two bodies looked the same. Makeup designer David Leroy Anderson and his team grounded their work in uncomfortable realism. Rather than stylized horror, they studied forensic textbooks and real crime scene photographs to understand how human bodies actually decompose. Skin tones followed biological logic. Swelling, dryness, and discoloration were treated as physical processes, not visual flourishes. The result was overwhelming. On set, the sheer number of fully realized zombies created an atmosphere that went beyond performance. Cast members have described moments where the illusion felt uncomfortably real, as if the production itself had been swallowed by the apocalypse it was trying to depict. What made the achievement remarkable wasn't just the number of zombies, but the refusal to simplify them. Each face carried its own story of decay. In a genre increasingly dominated by digital shortcuts, Dawn of the Dead chose exhaustion, precision, and realism, and paid for it in hours, sweat, and a level of discomfort that cameras could only partially capture. Number 10. The bloated female zombie was actually played by a man. One of the film's most grotesque images arrives without warning. A massively bloated female zombie charges toward Anna, her body swollen, distorted, and deeply unsettling. The moment is designed to overwhelm the viewer, and it succeeds. What most audiences never realize is that the performer inside the prosthetics wasn't a woman at all. The character was played by stuntman and actor H.R. Gradison, whose body was completely transformed through layers of prosthetics, padding, and makeup. The illusion was so convincing that even attentive viewers rarely questioned it. The swollen proportions, sagging skin, and unnatural movement were all carefully engineered to erase any trace of the performer's real identity. The transformation process was one of the most time-consuming effects in the film. Multiple hours were required to apply the prosthetic suit, secure the padding, and blend the makeup seamlessly with the performer's movements. The goal wasn't caricature, it was discomfort. The creature needed to feel physically wrong in a way that defied easy categorization. Gradison was no stranger to demanding physical roles. His background as a stunt performer allowed him to move convincingly under the heavy costume, maintaining balance and aggression despite limited visibility and restricted motion. That physical control is what sells the scene. The zombie doesn't stumble, it advances with purpose. The reveal adds another layer to the moment. A character designed to horrify through exaggeration was created by disguising reality rather than enhancing it. In a film built on deception, where safety, identity, and humanity are constantly misread, the bloated zombie stands as a reminder that the most disturbing illusions are often the ones that hide in plain sight. Number 11. Real footage of human violence was mixed into the opening credits. The opening credits of Dawn of the Dead are designed to feel overwhelming. Riots, panic, brutality, images of a world collapsing under its own weight. What most viewers assume is fictional chaos is, in part, something far more unsettling. Interwoven with the staged zombie footage are real archival images of human violence and civil unrest. These weren't recreated scenes or background texture. They were authentic newsreel clips documenting riots, police confrontations, and real acts of brutality from the modern world. The footage was deliberately edited to blur the boundary between reality and fiction. The effect is subtle but powerful. As the credits unfold, it becomes increasingly difficult to tell where real-world suffering ends and zombie horror begins. That confusion was intentional. The filmmakers wanted the audience to feel disoriented, unsettled by the idea that humanity's real capacity for violence might not be so different from the fictional apocalypse unfolding on screen. By placing real violence alongside imaginary monsters, the film makes an uncomfortable suggestion. The most frightening images aren't necessarily the zombies, they're the people. The chaos, fear, and aggression shown in the archival footage mirror the breakdown of society depicted in the film, making the apocalypse feel less like fantasy and more like an extension of existing human behavior. This choice transforms the opening credits into more than atmosphere. They become a statement. Before a single character speaks, the film quietly argues that the collapse of civilization doesn't begin with the dead rising, it begins with the living turning on one another. Number 12. Zack Snyder makes a brief cameo during the opening chaos. Hidden inside the frenzy of the opening sequence is a detail most viewers never notice. Amid the gunfire, confusion, and collapsing order, the film's director briefly appears on screen. Zack Snyder makes a cameo during the opening credits, blending himself into the very chaos he helped create. The appearance is fleeting. Snyder plays one of the armed security personnel during the attack on the U.S. Capitol, visible only for a moment as the camera cuts rapidly between scenes of panic and violence. There's no emphasis placed on the cameo, no pause to acknowledge it. If you blink, you miss it. For a first-time feature director, the cameo carried quiet symbolism. Rather than placing himself in a controlled or humorous moment, Snyder inserted his presence into one of the film's most unstable sequences. The choice reflects his hands-on approach during production. He wasn't observing from a distance. He was immersed, surrounded by noise, pressure, and the weight of a genre with a devoted and demanding fan base. Director cameos are often playful signatures. This one feels different. It doesn't invite attention. It dissolves into the violence. Snyder becomes just another figure swallowed by the collapse he's depicting, indistinguishable from the characters caught in the opening panic. In a film obsessed with the loss of control and the illusion of safety, the director's brief appearance carries an unintended irony. Even the person shaping the story isn't above the chaos. He exists inside it, briefly visible, then gone. Number 13. 3 actors from the original film appear only on television screens. The remake's connection to George A. Romero's original Dawn of the Dead isn't announced loudly. Instead, it hides in plain sight, flickering across television screens that the survivors barely pay attention to. 3 performers from the 1978 classic reappear in the remake, but only as distant figures mediated through broadcasts. Ken Foree, who played Peter in the original film, appears as a televangelist delivering one of the franchise's most iconic lines, "When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth." In the remake, the line doesn't arrive as prophecy spoken by a hero. It comes through a screen, stripped of authority, almost drowned out by noise and disbelief. Scott Reiniger, who portrayed Roger in the original, appears as a military general urging citizens to stay in their homes. His message is calm, controlled, and completely ineffective. Tom Savini, the legendary effects artist who also played the biker Blades in the 1978 film, shows up as a sheriff, explaining the basic rule of survival: shoot zombies in the head. These appearances aren't celebratory cameos, they're deliberately detached. The characters speak truth, warnings, and instructions, but no one is really listening. Their presence suggests that the lessons of the past still exist, yet they're confined to screens, reduced to background noise in a world already collapsing. By placing the original cast behind glass, the remake makes a quiet statement. The voices that once carried meaning have been relegated to static. Knowledge survives, but attention doesn't. And in that disconnect lies one of the film's most subtle acknowledgments of its legacy. Number 14. A commercial directed by Snyder appears on television during the shower scene. Early in the film, as the world begins to collapse, Anna stands in the shower, half aware of the chaos unfolding outside. In the background, a television plays quietly. What most viewers register as meaningless noise is actually a carefully placed personal reference. The commercial on the screen, a Subaru WRX advertisement, was directed by Zack Snyder himself just 1 year before Dawn of the Dead entered production. Before stepping into feature filmmaking, Snyder built his career in advertising, crafting visually aggressive, tightly edited commercials that emphasized motion, impact, and precision. The Subaru spot was part of that phase. This wasn't paid product placement, it was an inside reference. By inserting his own commercial into the film, Snyder left a trace of where he came from, embedding his past work inside his first major feature. The moment lasts only seconds, easily overlooked, but it connects two worlds: controlled, polished advertising, and the uncontrolled collapse depicted in the film. The placement is quietly ironic. A commercial designed to sell speed, freedom, and performance plays during a scene where normal life is already slipping away. The promises of modern consumer culture continue broadcasting, even as they lose all relevance. In a movie set largely inside a shopping mall, saturated with symbols of consumption and comfort, the appearance of Snyder's commercial functions like a signature hidden in plain sight. It reminds attentive viewers that Dawn of the Dead was shaped by a filmmaker transitioning from selling products to depicting the end of the world. Number 15. Several mall store names were secret tributes to the original film. The mall in Dawn of the Dead isn't just a setting, it's a carefully constructed archive of hidden references. Scattered throughout the background are store names that most viewers walk past without noticing, each one quietly pointing back to George A. Romero's 1978 original. One of the most direct tributes appears in the form of a store named Galen Ross, honoring the actress who played Francine in the original film. The name isn't highlighted or framed, it simply exists, blending into the mall's artificial normalcy. Another reference appears with Wooly's Diner, a nod to the character Wooly, the racist SWAT team leader from Romero's version. These weren't random labels chosen by the production design team. They were deliberate insertions, placed with restraint. The filmmakers avoided overt nostalgia, opting instead for subtle acknowledgments that rewarded viewers familiar with the source material. The references didn't interrupt the story. They lived inside it. What makes these tributes meaningful is where they're placed. In a mall designed to represent consumption, routine, and distraction, the names of past characters become part of the background noise. History is present, but ignored. Legacy exists, but it isn't foregrounded. By hiding these names in plain sight, the remake acknowledges its origins without trying to replicate them. It doesn't attempt to replace the original. It quietly coexists with it, allowing attentive viewers to discover that the past is still there, embedded in the walls, unread, and waiting. Number 16. The Bleak end credit scenes were filmed beside a Universal Studios gift shop. The fate of the survivors in Dawn of the Dead doesn't end when the main story does. During the end credits, the film shifts into a series of grainy, handheld sequences that document what happens after the escape, moments that feel improvised, desperate, and terminal. What few viewers realize is how disconnected these scenes were from the rest of the production. These final moments were not filmed alongside the main movie. They were shot later, after preview audiences reacted negatively to the original ending, which cut off abruptly once the survivors sailed away. Test viewers wanted closure. The studio wanted resolution. What they got instead was something far darker. According to Zack Snyder's DVD commentary, the end credit footage was filmed at Universal Studios Hollywood, on the backlot, at an artificial body of water known as Park Lake. Just a short distance away sat a fully operational Universal Studios gift shop, bright, commercial, and completely indifferent to the bleak narrative being captured nearby. The contrast was extreme. While tourists browsed souvenirs and theme park merchandise, the film's cast performed scenes of desperation, hunger, and inevitable collapse. The location underscored the artificial nature of the setting, yet the tone of the footage sold authenticity through chaos and despair. These scenes reframed the ending entirely. Escape was no longer a victory. Survival became temporary. Hope dissolved quietly during the credits, long after most films would have offered relief. What makes the revelation unsettling isn't the backlot itself, but the irony. A story about the end of consumer society was finalized within walking distance of one of its most polished temples. Proof that even the bleakest conclusions are sometimes constructed in the most ordinary places. Number 17. Sarah Polley's own agent was shocked she accepted the role. When Sarah Polley was cast as Anna, the choice surprised more than just audiences, it shocked her own agent. At the time, Polley was known primarily for serious, character-driven roles within Canadian and independent cinema projects rooted in realism, restraint, and emotional complexity. A fast-paced zombie remake was the last place anyone expected her to appear. Polley herself later admitted that the role seemed like an unlikely fit on paper, but what drew her in wasn't the genre, it was the character. Anna wasn't written as a passive figure meant to scream and flee. She was calm, observant, and emotionally contained, even as the world unraveled around her. Polley saw the opportunity to play someone who processed horror internally rather than reacting to it theatrically. This perspective shaped her performance. Anna doesn't dominate scenes with exaggerated fear. She absorbs chaos quietly, responding with hesitation and restraint. That approach grounded the film during its most frantic moments, giving the audience a human anchor amid relentless motion. For Polley, accepting the role wasn't a departure from her career path, it was an extension of it. She viewed Dawn of the Dead not as genre spectacle, but as a study of how ordinary people endure extreme circumstances. Her agent may have been surprised, but the choice proved strategic. By placing a dramatic actor at the center of a violent remake, the film gained emotional weight it might otherwise have lacked. Polley's presence didn't soften the horror. It made it feel closer, quieter, and harder to escape. Number 18. Zack Snyder agreed to direct a sequel that never happened. After Dawn of the Dead proved to be a commercial success, conversations about a sequel began almost immediately. Universal Pictures approached Zack Snyder with interest in continuing the story, and for a brief period, the project appeared to have real momentum. Snyder publicly stated that he had agreed to direct a follow-up. At the time, the remake had validated him as a filmmaker capable of handling scale, pressure, and audience expectations. A sequel seemed like the natural next step, but timing, ambition, and opportunity began pulling Snyder in different directions. Offers arrived quickly. Projects like 300, Watchmen, and later Man of Steel shifted his career onto a much larger stage. As years passed, the sequel quietly slipped into development limbo. No official cancellation was announced. It simply stopped moving forward. Studio priorities changed. Creative focus shifted. The moment passed. More than 2 decades later, the sequel still doesn't exist. The closest spiritual successor came in 2021 with Snyder's Netflix film Army of the Dead, which revisited familiar themes, large-scale outbreaks, moral collapse, and even the controversial zombie baby concept. Yet, despite the similarities, it was never positioned as a continuation of Dawn of the Dead. The unrealized sequel stands as a reminder of how quickly opportunity can vanish in Hollywood. Success doesn't guarantee continuation. Sometimes, it only opens doors that lead elsewhere. In the end, Dawn of the Dead remains a closed chapter, not because it failed, but because its creator outgrew it before returning. Number 19. Snyder had to fight the studio to keep the Richard Cheese cover. One of the film's most oddly memorable moments arrives not through violence, but through music. During a montage inside the mall, a lounge-style cover of Down with the Sickness plays soft, ironic, and deeply unsettling. That choice wasn't universally welcomed. Zack Snyder had to push hard for the Richard Cheese version to remain in the film. Studio executives initially rejected the idea, preferring the original heavy metal track by Disturbed. To them, the aggressive version felt more appropriate for a fast-moving zombie apocalypse. Snyder disagreed. He argued that the lounge cover captured something far more disturbing than raw aggression. The soft vocals and casual delivery turned the scene into a parody of normalcy, highlighting how the survivors attempted to recreate everyday life while surrounded by death. The contrast wasn't accidental, it was the point. The debate went back and forth before the studio finally relented. When the scene made it into the final cut, the effect was immediate. The music didn't energize the montage, it hollowed it out. What should have felt like victory instead felt wrong, fragile, and temporary. In hindsight, the decision defined the tone of the film more clearly than any action sequence. Violence was expected, irony wasn't. By pairing comfort with collapse, Snyder revealed how quickly humans cling to ritual when meaning disappears. The fight over that song wasn't about taste. It was about whether the film would embrace discomfort or retreat into familiarity. Number 20. George A. Romero dismissed the remake as a film without meaning. When George A. Romero finally watched the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead, his reaction was measured but unmistakably critical. Having completed his own sequel, Land of the Dead, Romero approached the film without immediate hostility. In fact, he acknowledged that the opening 15 to 20 minutes impressed him. The chaos worked, the tension landed. Then, in his view, something disappeared. Romero described the remake as feeling more like a video game than a film with intent. Fast, aggressive, technically effective, but hollow. What troubled him wasn't the violence or the scale, it was the absence of subtext. In the original 1978 film, the mall wasn't just a location, it was a critique. a metaphor for consumerism, routine, and societal decay. Romero felt that the remake abandoned that layer entirely. His strongest criticism focused on the running zombies. To Romero, speed stripped the creatures of their symbolism. They became obstacles instead of reflections of humanity. He famously remarked that he wasn't frightened by things running at him, comparing the experience to playing Space Invaders. The comment wasn't just dismissive, it was philosophical. Romero later folded this criticism directly into his own work. In Diary of the Dead, a character explicitly states that dead things don't run. It was a quiet rebuttal, aimed less at the remake itself and more at what Romero believed the genre was becoming. Yet history complicated his judgment. Over time, the 2004 Dawn of the Dead gained recognition as one of the strongest horror remakes ever made. Audiences and critics reassessed it not as a replacement for Romero's vision, but as a different interpretation, one shaped by post-9/11 anxiety, speed, and loss of control. Romero may have felt the remake lacked meaning. Others saw meaning in its brutality. The disagreement reveals something deeper. Horror evolves by breaking from its origins, even when the original creator refuses to follow. And sometimes, the most telling legacy of a film isn't whether it honors the past, but whether it forces the past to argue back. Behind the speed, the violence, and the spectacle, Dawn of the Dead, 2004, exists as a film shaped as much by conflict as by intention. Accidents were mistaken for effects. Creative risks triggered outrage. Tributes were hidden in plain sight. And the very creator of the original vision rejected what this version became. What emerged wasn't a simple remake. It was a reflection of a different era, one defined by urgency, anxiety, and loss of control. Where the original lingered on decay, the remake accelerated it. Where meaning was once spelled out, it was replaced with motion, pressure, and survival at any cost. Over time, the film has been reassessed, not as a replacement for Romero's work, but as a document of its moment. A horror story shaped by the early 2000s, by post-crisis fear, and by a generation no longer waiting for symbols to explain what was happening around them. Whether that makes the remake shallow or honest depends entirely on how you define meaning in horror. So now, the question turns to you. Do you believe Dawn of the Dead, 2004, sacrificed depth for intensity, or did it simply express its message in a language the genre hadn't spoken before? And which horror film should we dissect next? Another controversial remake, a cult classic with hidden scars, or a modern film whose secrets are still buried? Let us know in the comments.